Building along with Andrea Horwath and Councillor McConnell. He's speaking to the reporters right now there. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I know that I've said these things before, but I think they bear repetition, and I intend to continue to repeat them because I think it's important for the people to understand these things. Toronto Community Housing is home to 110,000 people. That's a population approximately the same size as Thornhill. This particular complex that we're in today houses nearly 1,000 people in total across the buildings, 20% of them seniors, 25% of them on disability support, 25% single-parent households, just to cite some of the demographic characteristics of the people who live here. No other city in Ontario has more than, in fact, none of them even have a number approaching 58,000 social housing units. And no other city has a $2.6 billion housing repair backlog on buildings, the majority of which were downloaded by other levels of government, with a significant number of those previously belonging to the Ontario government being poorly built and or in a poor state of repair when they were downloaded. That's why I've been standing up for Toronto and calling on both the province and the federal government to pay their fair share towards social housing repairs. Property taxes were never meant to bear fixing a problem of this magnitude. The city has already found ways to put $1 billion of city-derived funds towards the repair backlog. In relative terms, that is a huge start financed by the city through its means, but it cannot be the end. The federal government has pledged billions in the 2017 budget for housing infrastructure, and we're confident that once the details of that funding are worked out, and those discussions are underway, Government of Canada money will be flowing towards TCHC repairs. I have been consistently and frequently assured that will be the case, in particular that we will have the flexibility with the housing money allocated in the 2017 budget to direct a portion of it to social housing repairs. So that just leaves us with the need for one more partner at the table. I've made it clear that I'm going to be talking to all Ontario party leaders about where they stand on addressing Toronto's social housing needs, starting as we should with repairs to our existing social housing stock home to 110,000 Torontonians, 110,000 residents of Ontario. And I want to thank Ms. Horwath for coming out and pledging that the NDP would pay a third of the housing repair costs should they form the next government. That's an important commitment, and as I've told every party leader, if you come through on your commitments to Toronto, I will be there to acknowledge that wherever and whenever. I will ensure that prominent attention is given to such a contribution at each and every project, including these ones here, which benefit from such an investment. Morally, socially, economically, I believe we all have to stand together, and by that I mean not just all governments. All governments have to stand together, but this community, the province of Ontario, we have to stand together to address the poor state of housing, home to more than 100,000 of our most vulnerable residents in the City of Toronto. In my case, I must fight for some of Toronto's neediest residents and stand up for the city and its needs, and I continue to make the case for Toronto, as I will continue to do. Ms. Horwath and the Ontario NDP are the first leader and party to explicitly embrace this social housing responsibility in partnership with the people of Toronto. They have my thanks for this commitment, which would help fix housing, address a moral gap, and create more construction work. And I intend to work very hard to see that she is not the last of the party leaders to make such a welcome commitment. And it is now my pleasure to ask Andrea Horwath, the leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party, to come to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hello, everyone. It is certainly my pleasure to be with you today. I want to first start by thanking Mayor Tory and his team for organizing this tour, and Councillor McConnell for joining us. Social housing is an extremely important issue. Across the province, Ontarians are struggling. Families, regardless of income, have been hard hit by decades of downloading and budget cutting. But few have been hit harder than those who live in Toronto community housing and social housing across the province. The conditions we saw here today are heartbreaking, and I'm very grateful to the residents who opened their doors to let us see their struggles up close, and talked about some of the repairs that are needed in her unit. Assad showed us some of the damage in his kitchen that needs to be addressed. The people who call social housing home are families and parents, children, and retirees. They're hardworking Ontarians who deserve safe, clean, and affordable housing. Now, I know this is an issue that matters to Toronto City Council a great deal. The City of Toronto is investing $900 million in the repair of Toronto Community Housing Corporation stock, but so far neither the federal nor provincial governments have come to the table with their share. It's good news to hear from Mr. Tory that he's negotiating with the federal government in that regard, and I hope that those negotiations are very successful for the City of Toronto. The newest provincial budget was Premier Wynne's chance to undo some of the damage that her Liberal government has done to community housing across the province. In 2018, provincial funding for Toronto's housing programs is expected to be less than half of what the city received in 2011. That's a loss of nearly $180 million a year. For Toronto's social housing, emergency shelters, and homelessness prevention programs. There's almost no money for new affordable housing in this budget, and there's no money for social housing repairs, which leaves urgently needed social housing stock at risk of closure, especially in cities like Toronto, where the repair backlog has reached crisis levels, as has been described by Mayor Tory. This budget will not help any of the 181,000 families on the affordable housing wait list, and it will not protect any family living in social housing whose home is at risk of closure due to repair problems. With this recent provincial budget, it has become clear that if Ontarians want a provincial government that will take social housing seriously, they'll have to wait for a change in government. I've made it clear to Mayor Tory and Councillor McConnell that if the NDP is elected in 2018, New Democrats will meet the province's responsibility to repair social housing and shelters across Ontario. A New Democrat government will step up to the plate and pay its fair share of the desperately needed repairs to social housing. We'll stop the downloading and cuts. We will be partners in housing. And will invest in the social programs, healthcare, transit, and childcare programs that vulnerable and low-income families need to get ahead. Every Ontarian deserves a safe, clean, affordable place to live. And New Democrats believe firmly that a provincial government needs to be in partner with cities, with municipalities, in making sure that that can occur. We'll deliver exactly what's needed. Thank you so much.
So we will entertain your questions on this or other matters, as you wish.
Mayor, what happens if the governing party, the Liberals, do not come up with money? What's the next step?
Well, we obviously have the need for that money as soon as possible. We're exhausting the city's, contribution of close to $1 billion, and I certainly would intend to make sure the people of Toronto know when they come to vote in the election that parties have taken the positions they have, if that's where things end up. But I've got to keep working at this, and I'm going to look at the glass, as I usually do, as half full, and hope that the commitment that Ms. Horwath has made in the NDP will cause the others to pause and reflect, not just on matters of money. I hope they will pause and reflect on who we're talking about here. We're talking about single families. We're talking about people on disability. We're talking about elderly people who have nowhere else to turn. And we see the conditions in which they're asked to live in housing that belongs to the public. And so I just believe in the end that Premier Wynne will come to the same conclusion, because I know what's in her heart and I know what she said before about these kinds of things, that it is the right thing to do to find some way in which to step up, as Ms. Horwath and the NDP have done this morning. And I intend to keep working at this and keep watching this and comment as necessary.
But $350 million is needed for next year. Is Council going to have to take some action?
Well, we're certainly not in a position. I mean, again, there are hopeful discussions taking place with the federal government, and maybe they'll be the next partner to come to the table in this regard. And I'm certainly counting on what they've told me over and over again about the flexibility we'll have with their money that was included in the budget. But we're going to take this one step at a time. But we're not going to stop doing repairs because that would be just the wrong thing to do. But I do think that I have to continue to urge the other governments to step up and do their part. And I think Ms. Horwath's commitment on behalf of the Ontario NDP today is helpful in that regard, because that's what a democracy is all about, is having people encouraged and urged to step up their game by people who take leadership on these kinds of issues.
Ms. Horwath, what do you think of the Mayor's call to keep criminals who have been evicted from TCH buildings from being rehoused?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that affects the safety and the sense of stability of the entire community. I think that there certainly needs to be acknowledgement that folks coming out of incarceration are going to need some place to live. So you have to be careful about not having people become desperate and have increased rates of recidivism as a result of lack of housing. But it is important, I think, to acknowledge that the other tenants, the other residents in the buildings need to have a sense of security as well. So I think it's good that the council has been debating and discussing this issue to find the balance between making sure that those folks who live in housing can feel secure in their homes and not be worried about crime in their neighborhood, but also acknowledging that as a society we have to worry about the other side of the picture as well in terms of stability and recidivism.
Members of your party have said that it's difficult for the province to flow money to City Council when City Council insists on tax increases of only 2% or less any given year. Is it wise to write a blank check for City Council for 1/3 of the TCHC funds?
Well, I think what's wise is recognizing and acknowledging that unless the other orders of government step up to the plate and help repair the social housing stock here in the City of Toronto, which of course, as the Mayor has said and is true, has the largest problem in terms of scale, but this problem exists around the province, make no mistake. It's absolutely important and necessary to acknowledge that the other orders of government have a responsibility to ensure that the social housing stock is able to be maintained so that those very vulnerable families, low-income families, people with disabilities, people with mental health issues, seniors, are able to have a roof over their head that they're secure about. And the last thing that we need in the City of Toronto or anywhere else in the province is to lose more of our social housing stock to lack of repair problems. I mean, it's unacceptable. We have hundreds of thousands of people on waiting lists around Ontario. I don't know how many are on the waiting list here. Do you know offhand? Almost 100,000. And yet units are being closed. That's completely irresponsible. And I think it's also important to note that municipalities have the most difficult time when it comes to access to, to ways to fund these kinds of programs. That's why we've made the commitment on social housing stock. That's why we've made the commitment to share 50% or to take back 50% of the operating cost of transit systems. That's why I made the commitment back in February with the Mayor around childcare rather, and childcare subsidies and the help with that, because these are the kinds of social programs that require partnership from other orders of government.
May I just make a comment on that? If we hadn't stepped up to the tune of $1 billion of city-derived funds, then I would say that criticism, might be warranted, but we have. And I would say that the notion that the entirety of a bill of $2.6 billion was ever in the contemplation of property taxes to be met by property taxpayers alone is just not on. This amounts to a social program, and social programs are not meant to be paid for in their entirety or in large measure by property taxes. Property taxes are meant to pay for basic services to people, and they do. But the notion that we should be left alone to fund a $2.6 billion property tax, $2.6 billion repair backlog, as I pointed out last week, that would lead to a double-digit increase in property taxes, and property taxes were never meant to finance that kind of thing, nor were they meant to finance in their entirety huge transit projects. That was not the intention of the system, and that would not be a responsible thing to do in the context of fairness as between governments and their respective sources of revenue.
A couple more questions.